Hi class. In this video, I'm going to be covering 2D collisions. This is kind of the most basic form of physics programming that we have to learn in order to be able to create video games. Collisions in 2D specifically are also very important for basically any type of application that has interaction. So anytime you click on a button, anytime you move your mouse into an area or something like that, you are going to be using 2D collision. So I'll be going over a specific type of collision in this video, and we're going to be using it to kind of enable this functionality in the scene that we're working on. But it really applies broadly to all sorts of different things. So it's a good thing to be learning about. We'll use it for other stuff as we go out throughout the semester. So let's get started. So we're going to kind of pick up where the last video left off. I'm going to open up GitHub Desktop as usual. Okay, and I don't need to duplicate my files because I already did that. So I'm just going to click Open in Sublime Text. And I'm going to go to Project 1.4, which is what we're working on this week, and then go to sketch.js. And so we can take a look at the function that we created last time, the sign function right here. And so we're going to add some functionality to this so that it only reveals the text when the user or when the player or the character is actually near the sign. And we're going to use 2D collisions to do that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how that works. But first, let's open our project. I'm going to go to Sublime Server, make sure that's running, and open a new window. Okay, and so I'm going to go to localhost 8080, MMP 310. I haven't added a link for this project yet, so I'm just going to say project 1-4. There's our signs that we created in the last video. And so I'm going to open up the console so I have that ready as well. And so since we're creating a game or an interactive scene, we do want our player to have to interact with stuff. So if we just show all the text at the beginning, they're not going to have to walk around and discover things. So we're just going to use a simple 2D box collision detection to see if the player is near the sign. If they are, we'll reveal the text on the sign. So the way that this is going to work is that we have basically all of our shapes in our scenes, even though there's a little bit of like transparency around the details. Most of them have like an origin point in the middle, and then they have like a bounding box. And so they have a width and a height. And we know the X and Y value of our character. We have that stored as a global variable. And we also know the X and Y value of our signs because that's the arguments in the function that we created. And so what we want to know is if our character is, here versus like here. So if the character is right here, we'll show the text for that. If the character is over here, then we won't see it. And the way that we can do that is by comparing the size and position of the two boxes. And so normally this is pretty easy to do. You just start with the upper left-hand corner and then kind of calculate based on that. Ours is going to be a little bit more complicated because our character and all of our images are actually drawn from the center. So we have to account for that. So let's actually go over, I'll just open up a new tab. Okay, so I'm just going to use this blank tab to draw here. So let's say this is our sign. So let's say this is the bounding box of our sign. And the XY position is right here. And we know the width of the image. Let's call that W. And we know the height of the image. Let's call that H. Okay, and then let's say we have our character over here. And we know the XY, that's Jerry X, Jerry Y. And we also know the image width and the image height. And so they're basically, for us to know that there's a collision, there's 4 things that have to be true. And so we can test for that using a compound conditional. So we reviewed conditionals a bit in week 1. We'll be using them more this week. So let's just look at the possibilities. If you have a big square here, okay, there's a few different ways that a square could intersect, right? It could be here, it could be over here, it could be here, it could be completely inside, it could be over here, etc. So there's a few different places where these squares can intersect. And we can figure out the collisions based on this. And this isn't something that we have to learn on our own. This is something that has been, known in computer graphics and programming for a very long time. So we're really just borrowing the way that other people have figured it out. But by going through how the math actually works, we can kind of explain a bit more about why this is the way it is. So what we're going to have to do is calculate a few different things. So let's imagine that this is our sign and our player is overlapping the sign right here. So we want to know that they're overlapping. And so let's remember that the sign XY is here, the player XY is here. So the XY of the sign isn't inside of the player, and the XY of the player isn't inside of the sign. So we can't do just simple XY versus a box. We have to actually look at the size of the two boxes. For this box to be inside this box, one thing that we know to start is that this X value, this line here, has to be less than this line over here, right? If this line is on this side over here, we know that no matter what, this box, if this box is all the way over in, this side somewhere, we know that it's not inside the box. Likewise, if the box is over here, we know it's not. If it's over here, we know it's not. And if it's down here, we know it's not inside. So we can test all four of those conditions to see, is the box inside? The trick here is because our boxes are drawn from the middle, we have to calculate using that offset. So it's a little bit more complicated. So let's call this line, let's calculate that first. So let's call this box PX for the player. So that's the player X, okay? And then we have to go back half of the player width. So minus player width divided by 2. Okay, so that value has to be on the left side or less than this side of the box. So that's less than, okay? And then this side of the box is the sine X. So let's call that sine X plus half the sine width. So we're going this way. So plus sine W over 2. Okay, so that's condition 1. And then the next condition is that this line has to be greater than this line, right? Because if this line was less than this line, if the player right side was less than the box or sign left side, then we'd be over here. Okay, so that's the player X plus half the player width. Okay, that has to be greater than. Okay, it has to be to the right of the sines X minus the sine width. Okay, so it's a little bit more, it's going to end up looking very similar, but we just have to get everything in the right order. That's the sine X minus the sine width over 2. So that tells us that some part of this box horizontally is inside of our sine box, as long as, these two things are true. So that's 1, that's 2. That's the X value. So now we do the same thing on the Y value. And, you can probably guess what it's going to be. Okay, so let's do the Ys. Okay, so we'll start with player Y. Okay, so we're basically just recreating the two rules on the X, but now we're doing it horizontally. So if we start with the top, we know that the top of the box has to be less than the bottom of the sign. Okay, if the top of the box is down here, then none of the player, because the player is going to be over here, is inside of the sign. So the player Y, to get to the top, we actually do minus. Okay, so same thing, player Y minus player height over 2. That has to be less than, okay, SY, the sines Y, plus the sine height over 2. Okay, looks exactly the same, except now we have Y's instead of X's, and we have height, H's, instead of W's. Okay, so that's 3. We have one more, and it's, the reverse of that. So player Y, okay, plus player height over 2. Okay, that's the bottom of the box. The bottom of the box has to be greater than the top of the sign, right? If the bottom of the player is up here, so the player is up here, then we know that no part of the player is inside of the box. Okay, so that has to be greater than, this is number 4, that has to be greater than the sine y minus the sine h divided by 2. Okay, so that's a little bit complicated, but the nice thing is that once we write that math down and we put it in our program, we never have to change it. It's always going to work, and we're going to apply it to a lot of collisions in the future. So let's add that in and just make sure it works. What that's going to tell us is that we're inside the box. Okay, so we're going to start with an if statement, and if this thing is true, that's when we're going to reveal the text. So I'm going to put that whole text, I'm going to indent everything over. All that stuff is going to go inside of this if statement. So we won't see this unless the player is in that box. Now we have to think about what our values are. So this is where it's going to get a bit complicated. So I'm going to put these each on a different line. So our first one is that the player x, and we have a variable for this, Jerry x, okay, minus half of Jerry's width. So we don't really know Jerry's width, but we do know that he has this idle image, and we can get the width of the idle image. So we say Jerry idle, whoops, that's not capitalized, Jerry idle.width divided by 2. Okay, so that value has to be less than the right side of the box. So that's the x value that we got from our draw function for this particular sign. The nice thing with the functions is we can do this with all of the signs with the same code. So that x value plus the sign image dot width divided by 2. And then we're just going to keep going from here. So I'm going to put a double ampersand at the end of this line. So all of these conditions have to be true. So we use the double ampersand for and. Jerry x plus Jerry idle.width over 2. So that's the right side of Jerry. The right side of Jerry has to be greater than x minus sign image.width over 2. The right side of Jerry has to be greater than the left side of the sign. Okay, double ampersand. Forgot the y here. Now we move to the y and the height. So same thing, but just with y instead of x and height instead of width. So Jerry y minus Jerry idle dot height over 2. So that is the top of Jerry. The top of Jerry has to be less than the bottom of the sign. So y plus sign image dot height over 2. And usually this is less complicated. It's really because our images are drawing from the center that we have to kind of offset everything by half the width and half the height. So finally, our last one is Jerry y plus Jerry idle dot height over 2. Okay, that has to be greater than, that's the top of Jerry. The top of Jerry has to be greater than the bottom of the sign. So y minus sign image dot height over 2. Okay, so you might be thinking this is insane. Like, how much code is this? I don't need the last ampersand because that's my 4 conditions, and we'll go see if this works. So I'm just going to write here 2D collision between player or Jerry and sign. And so that looks like a lot of crazy code, but because it's in a function, we only have to do it once, and we can use it for all of our signs. So that's the great thing about using a function. So let's go back to our project, and there we go. We can see that Jerry, because he's kind of in the middle of the scene when we start, he can see that text. When he goes over here, he can see that text. And then when he goes all the way over here, then he gets this last piece of text, and we're gonna, wander off to the west. And then, so since Jerry starts in the center, we might want to change that. You can see it doesn't really look like he's actually overlapping, but we have to keep in mind that there is a bunch of like alpha here. So if we move a little bit of away, we can see that that's pretty accurate. But as soon as Jerry touches like the bottom of the sign, that's when we see it. And that's actually fine for this because we're just revealing the sign. We're not like detecting like if he's, you know, jumping on the sign or something like that. So it's okay if it shows up a little bit earlier than we want it to. So yeah, I might want to change either the position of Jerry, or I could also change the sign. So maybe I'll change the start here with the search for the magic wand. So I'm just going to take this out, put it here, and take this out and put it here. But yeah, when you guys are thinking about what to add into your scene, you know, you can add whatever you want and have the messages say whatever you want. So those will be my 3 signs. And we have some collisions. These are going to be really useful in the future. So besides just having text appear, you know, you could have other images, other animations appear. So we could have Jerry walking along and all of a sudden he runs into something, and you don't even actually have to have like a visual indicator. Like if I didn't have a sign at all, this function would still work. The sign creates like a visual example for what to look for, but you can see the text still appears even if the sign isn't being drawn. So you could also use this to, you know, set traps or do other things in your scene. So there's a lot of different stuff you can do with a function. There's a lot of different stuff that you can do with a 2D collision, and the combination of the two means that as we move around the scene, we can make different things appear. And that's a really useful and important thing. That's sort of a foundational building block, not only of video games, but of all sorts of different applications. Okay, so that's it for this video. I'm gonna save another thumbnail to use in my portfolio page. So I'm just gonna go over here and do save. And this is 1-4. And I'm gonna add a new link to my portfolio. So I'm gonna go back here and then go to my Finder, no Finder window. So I'll just go new Finder window, go to the desktop and go to my MMP 310 folder. Here's project 1-4. And so let's bring in my thumbnail. So I'll go to downloads and drop this thumbnail in here. So now I've got that thumbnail. Let's go back to Sublime, and I'm gonna close this out and go to my main index page, and let's scroll down here. So I'm you know, on the 4th version of this, so I'm just gonna copy that and paste it. So this is project 1-4, and oh, I forgot to put the V in front of the image name, so let's just put that there. And the link is to project 1-4, and then it's still project 1. This one is functions plus collisions. Okay, so functions plus collisions. Here we go, start here and begin the search for the magic wand. And the magic wand is to the west. Okay, so again, use this to add something to your scene. Try to be creative about what you could add to your scene. You could add some characters that talk. You could add some like images to just change into something else, like something wacky or crazy. Whatever you think fits in what you're creating. You can even add something simple, like if you run into an enemy, they like, you know, die or splat or something like that. We'll add more stuff to make more kind of like physics-based interactions with other parts of the scene. But this is just getting started with something simple. Okay, so now that I've got my link working, I want to publish this. I'm going to close this window and close Sublime and go back to MMP 310. You can see all the changes that were added. So I'm going to say updates 1-4 and commit to master and push to origin. One thing that you might want to make sure is just go to your site and make sure it looks right. So I'm going to click view on GitHub, and I can just click to make sure that this, and so I can just go here and, you know, go to my GitHub pages real quick and just make sure everything works. Okay, so in this case, if the screen is a different size, the character is not on top of it. So I might want to use like a width and height variable instead of a hard-coded number for this sign, but it doesn't really matter. For this case, it's just kind of an example. So I'm just going to leave that as is. That's it for this video. So you guys can work on that. Let me know if you have any questions, and that's it.